Clause 4 of the standard is the context of the organization, and clause 4 is divided into 4 sub-clauses. The first one is understanding the organization and its context. So, what is context? Well, context refers to many factors. We can name vision, mission, or goals, or financial constraints, or products, or supply chain, or geographical location, or customer expectations, and of course requirements. So this is basically what context is. Now, this clause or this sub-clause requires the organization to determine all internal and external issues that may be relevant to the achievement of the objectives of the QMS or the quality management system. So, what is internal and external issues? Well, internal issues, or we can name some examples of internal issues like employee engagement, and our employees may be happy. And of course, training and development, skills and competence, physical resources, as well as, of course, technology and equipment. Of course, we can name management methodology, policies and mission values, suppliers and partner management. As for external issues, we can name government regulations and changes in the law, which is considered as a legal aspect. We can name the organization's competition, the competitors of the organization, and this is of course a market aspect. We can name the events that may affect corporate image and the changes in technology. As we know, every day the technology changes by the hour. We can name shareholders, political influences, environmental considerations, with now the global warming rising, or the global warming issue rising. Now, of course, this is not all the internal and external issues. Of course, this is just some examples. Now, after that, the organization is required to identify internal and external parties and their needs, and this is basically sub-clause 4.2. So we're gonna talk about this in the next video. After that, the organization may, I'm saying may because it's not mandatory, so the organization could document the context of the organization. The standard does not require the organization to document this information, but this would be helpful. Documenting the information could be helpful or would be helpful, but it's not mandatory. After that, the organization needs to monitor and review all that information. Now, as for auditing, the auditor is required to make interviews with top management. As you can guess, all the issues, the internal or external issues, change all the time. So we need interviews with top management, which of course the top management will present updated information to the auditor. And the auditor could document the information and could use the SWOT analysis, a great tool or a great way for establishing internal and external context is of course SWOT analysis. SWOT analysis means strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. Strengths, we can name an example for strength like innovation or reputation. Weaknesses could be cash flow or the age of the organization, and opportunities could be technological advances, and threats could be political interventions. The auditor could also use the PESTEL analysis, which means political, economic, sociological, technological, legal, and environmental. Subclause 2 of the context of the organization is understanding the needs and expectations of interested parties. So, the organization is required to identify these interested parties who are relevant to the QMS or the quality management system. So, who are these interested parties? Well, we're talking about anyone who is affected by what the organization does, like customers, employees, suppliers, corporate partners, owners or shareholders, insurance, society, service providers, competitors, government, police, even the fire brigade, and anyone, just anyone who has an impact on this business or the organization. So these parties add direct value to your organization, and they're affected by the activities within the organization. So it's important to identify their requirements or their needs and expectations. So the organization is required to determine the requirements of its interested parties. Now, if you have identified internal and external issues, identifying your interest or the interested parties would be real easy, and then the organization could, again I'm saying could because it's not mandatory, so the organization could document that information, and then the organization is required to monitor and review that information. Of course, we're talking about the internal and external issues and the interested parties and their requirements. So what are their requirements? What do we mean by the requirements of these interested parties? Well, you could identify the requirements of your interested parties by asking a few questions, like what are their terms and conditions? So what terms and conditions these interested parties have, or when will I be paid? So we're talking about money. And have we got effective communication? So if the communication between you and these interested parties, is it good or not? What information do I need, and when can they give it to me? Are they above board, and are they compliant with the applicable requirements? So asking these questions would easily identify the requirements of interested parties. Now, as for auditing, the auditor could always conduct interviews with top management and review any documents available. So the auditor could see whether or not the organization is keeping up with the requirements of its interested parties. So the third subclause of clause 4 is determining the scope of the quality management system, or QMS. So what do we mean by the scope? Well, the scope means the physical or geographical site within which your operations take place, and the products or services, of course, included in the QMS or the quality management system. Also, the relevant parties and any areas which you have determined to be not applicable. So, what does that mean? It means that the organization must consider the external and internal issues referred in 4.1, or the subclause, or the first subclause that we talked about earlier in earlier videos. And the organization must identify the requirements of the interested parties in the last video, or the previous video, or in the subclause 4.2. And the organization must consider the products and services it provides. Now, according to ISO 9001 2015 revision, all requirements are applicable regardless of the size and the products or services the organization is providing. And if a requirement cannot be applied, it must not affect the ability to provide conforming product, and it has to be justified. And this is what the last sentence is all about in here. So it says any areas which you have determined to be not applicable, because sometimes exclusions can be made and one requirement cannot be applied. Let's take the example of a bookstore that sells newspapers. Now, we all know that the bookstore does not produce these newspapers, but rather buys them from an external provider. And so that requirement can be excluded in a condition that that exclusion should be justified. Why justified? So that the auditor can review that justification. And this is what auditing is all about in this subclause. So first, the auditor has to review the quality management system documents. Now, the quality management system scope has to be documented. So QMS scope should be maintained as documented information. Now, and after that, the auditor has to review the justification of the requirements considered not applicable. So in the case of some requirement being not applicable, the auditor has to review the justification provided by the organization. The fourth subclause of clause 4 is quality management system and its processes. Now, we have already seen what a process is when we were talking about the quality management principles. So basically, the process is what turns an input element into an output element. Now, according to the standard, or according to the ISO 9001, the 2015 revision, the organization needs to establish, implement, maintain, and continually improve the QMS, or the quality management system, including the processes needed and their interactions in accordance with the requirements of this international standard, meaning ISO 9001-2015 revision. And this is of course taken from the standard itself. So, according to the standard, the organization must determine or identify inputs required and the outputs expected from the quality management processes. Let's take the example of electronic components which are considered input elements, and then they are turned into output element, which is the laptop, as you can see in here. And as you can guess, there are a number of examples of inputs and outputs. Now, the organization shall also determine the sequence and interaction of these processes. Sometimes the output of a process, the output of one process is actually the input of another process. So it is a sequence, or it is a series of processes, or it is a series of events that are interrelated. So that's why we say the sequence and interaction of these processes. Of course, the organization must also determine the criteria and methods, including measurements and related performance indicators needed to ensure the effectiveness of the operation and control. Performance indicator can be in the form of maybe the revenue or employee engagement, and are employees maybe happy, or are employees dedicated to our QMS or quality management system. And we can also name the efficiency of those processes. So the performance indicator can be in different forms. The organization must also assign responsibilities and authorities for those processes. In other words, we need to assign roles or jobs for the right people. People who are responsible for a process are often called process owners. The organization must also determine or identify or address risks and opportunities by planning and implementing appropriate actions. And we're going to talk more about this in later videos. Now, the organization must also maintain documented information that could change, or that are up, or that are subject to revision, like procedures, guidelines, softwares, or manuals. And it must also retain unchanged documented information to make sure that the processes are carried out as planned. Now, as for auditing, the auditor must identify the quality management system processes and their interaction. The auditor must also identify the inputs and outputs of those processes, and of course all of this is provided by the organization. And they also, I'm talking about the auditor, of course, the auditor must identify or determine the responsibilities and authorities provided by the organization, as well as risks and opportunities, criteria and methods, and the documented information, whether we're maintaining them or retaining them.